When we think about knights, we often think of the Templars, King Arthur, Lancelot, and bloody jousting battles. European knights were much more than a gimmick, however. They were central to warfare and society for almost all of the medieval period. Knights were noble cavalrymen who fought for their country and their god. Here we're exploring some of the lesser-known facts about medieval knights and the things they got up to. Number 1. License to kill. In the world of medieval warfare, knights were more than just heavily armored warriors on horseback. They were symbols of power, social order, and sanctioned violence. One of the most intriguing and lesser-known aspects of a knight's role in medieval society was the concept of being licensed to kill. This idea wasn't just a dramatic turn of phrase. It was in many cases a formal status granted to knights through specific legal and royal protections. During the Middle Ages, many knights operated under official documents known as letters of protection or letters of retainer. These legal instruments were issued by monarchs, nobles, or military commanders, and acted as guarantees of legal immunity. When a knight received such a letter, it meant that if he killed someone during battle, in the course of fulfilling his duties or while enforcing the law, he would not face prosecution. These letters served as a practical recognition that warfare, especially feudal and crusading warfare, was inherently violent, and that those committing acts of violence under legal or noble command needed to be protected from civil or ecclesiastical penalties. The scope of this immunity extended to both military engagements and certain law enforcement roles. For example, knights serving as royal agents or enforcers of feudal justice could use force, including lethal force, against outlaws, rebellious peasants, or rival factions. In these situations, the license to kill was more than symbolic. It allowed knights to maintain order or fulfill military objectives without fear of being dragged into court or excommunicated. The idea of legal immunity was also tied to the broader social status of knights. Since knights were usually drawn from the nobility, their privileged legal standing reflected their elevated social rank. Killing outside of battle wasn't always legal, but in the right context, such as suppressing a rebellion or executing royal orders, it could be justified and protected. This legal shield helped reinforce a knight's authority over lower classes and rivals, solidifying his role as an instrument of sanctioned violence. During the Crusades, this concept took on an even broader form. Papal endorsements of holy wars often came with full absolution for knights who killed infidels in battle. The Church granted spiritual immunity, declaring that such killings were not sins but acts of divine justice. In this way, knights were not only protected by secular law, but were spiritually rewarded for taking lives in the name of Christianity. What makes this concept so fascinating today is how different it was from modern understandings of justice and warfare. The medieval license to kill was an intersection of class privilege, military necessity, and religious ideology. Knights were essentially armed agents of the ruling order, given both legal and moral justification to use deadly force. While not all killings were excused, knights could still be punished for crimes like murder outside of combat. The protections they enjoyed were far beyond what any ordinary soldier or peasant could expect. This overlooked aspect of medieval knighthood shows how power, law, and violence were deeply intertwined during the era. Number 2. The power of the lance. Among the many weapons that medieval knights mastered, the lance held a position of exceptional importance. While modern audiences often associate knights with swords thanks to myths like King Arthur and Excalibur, in actual medieval combat, the lance was the primary and most devastating weapon used by mounted knights. The design and use of the lance were central to the effectiveness of cavalry charges, which were one of the most feared tactics on the battlefield. A knight charging at full speed on a powerful destrier, with a tightly gripped lance aimed at an enemy's shield or armor, could deliver an impact with incredible force, enough to unhorse a rider or pierce chainmail and even plate armor. Lances were typically between 9 and 14 feet long, and made from hardwood like ash or oak, chosen for strength and flexibility. They were often tipped with iron or steel points and sometimes equipped with a vamplate, a small circular guard that prevented the lance from sliding backward through the knight's hand on impact. The sheer momentum of a cavalry charge magnified the force of the lance strike, making it the medieval equivalent of a high-speed missile. Knights trained for years in mounted combat, and handling a lance effectively required precision, strength, and timing. Training often began in childhood and included jousting tournaments, which weren't just public spectacles but also practical combat training. In these controlled competitions, knights learned to aim, balance, and manage the shock of impact. Jousting helped develop the skills needed for real battle scenarios, where the stakes were life and death. The psychological effect of a massed cavalry charge with lances lowered was equally powerful. For infantry facing such a charge, the sight of armored knights bearing down at full speed was terrifying, and often caused lines to break before physical contact was even made. The lance represented not just military force, but the authority and prestige of the knightly class. Although the lance was incredibly effective, it was also a single-use weapon in most combat situations. Upon the initial clash, the lance would often shatter, bend, or be dropped. At that point, knights transitioned to their secondary weapons, typically swords, maces, or axes, for close-quarters combat. However, the sword, while iconic, was more of a backup weapon during the first intense moments of battle. What makes the lance so significant is how it shaped the structure and tactics of medieval warfare. Castles and battlefield formations were designed in part to withstand or counter the devastating impact of lance-based cavalry charges. Even armor evolved in response, with heavier designs and reinforced joints to withstand lance strikes. Knight's armor included features like lance rests on breastplates to help stabilize the weapon during a charge. The use of the lance is a reminder that medieval combat was not just brute strength, but also highly strategic and technical. The power of the lance helped define knightly warfare for centuries and played a major role in the dominance of cavalry in medieval Europe. Number 3, extensive training. Becoming a knight in the medieval era required far more than just wealth and noble birth. It demanded years of rigorous training, discipline, and physical endurance starting from early childhood. The process was long and demanding, beginning as early as the age of 7 and taking about 14 years before a young noble could be considered ready for the battlefield. The first stage in this journey was serving as a page. A page was not only a servant in a noble household, but also an apprentice in knightly culture. Pages performed tasks such as running messages, setting tables, and maintaining weapons. But beyond these duties, they began their early martial education. They learned basic sword handling, practiced with wooden weapons, and started riding horses. Interestingly, many of their lessons were taught through structured games designed to develop coordination, strength, and strategic thinking. Unlike modern childhood games, these were often combat-themed exercises using blunted weapons like wooden maces and mock shields to simulate real battle conditions in a safer environment. Alongside physical training, pages were also instructed in courtly manners, music, dancing, reading, and religious education, all critical for the development of a well-rounded knight who was expected not only to fight, but also to represent the values of chivalry, loyalty, and piety. At around the age of 14, a successful page would advance to become a squire, assuming he was physically capable and mentally prepared. This marked a serious escalation in training. As a squire, the young trainee served directly under an experienced knight, often accompanying him into battle or on military campaigns. Squires were responsible for maintaining their knight's armor, caring for his horse, and learning firsthand about battlefield tactics and leadership. They also trained daily in swordsmanship, jousting, archery, hand-to-hand combat, and horseback riding. These were not occasional lessons, but an intense and structured routine intended to forge the squire into a capable and disciplined warrior. During this period, squires also participated in mock battles, tournaments, and real skirmishes if circumstances allowed, which provided valuable combat experience in a controlled or semi-controlled environment. Additionally, squires continued to be educated in noble etiquette, diplomacy, and religious practices. A knight was not just a soldier, but also a representative of their lord or monarch. So the ability to act with dignity in both the battlefield and the court was essential. By the age of 21, a squire who had proven himself honorable, loyal, and skilled, would undergo the knighting ceremony, often during a formal event such as a feast, battle preparation, or religious celebration. The ceremony itself involved rituals like an overnight vigil, prayers, blessings from clergy, and finally the symbolic dubbing with a sword. This moment marked not only a personal transformation but also public recognition of the years of dedication it took to reach knighthood. Far from being a simple title, becoming a knight required discipline, endurance, and a lifelong commitment to martial excellence and moral duty. Number 4. Tournaments of life or death. Medieval knightly tournaments are often imagined as elegant displays of pageantry and chivalry, filled with shining armor, decorated horses, and noble cheers from the crowd. While these tournaments certainly carried a ceremonial aspect and were major social events, they were far from safe. In reality, many tournaments were brutal contests that tested the full range of a knight's combat abilities, and in the 13th century especially, they often turned deadly. For knights, tournaments were more than just games. They were a proving ground. These events were designed to simulate real warfare and allowed knights to demonstrate their skill, strength, and bravery in front of peers, nobles, and sometimes royalty. From an early age, young knights were conditioned to compete, and the tournament became a critical part of noble culture. Winning a tournament brought prestige, wealth, and recognition, while losing could result in serious injury or even death. Early medieval tournaments, particularly in France and England, were massive affairs, sometimes involving hundreds of mounted knights. The most common form of combat was the melee, which was a chaotic free-for-all between two large teams of knights across wide open fields. Unlike the more controlled environment of the joust, the melee had few rules, and the objective was to capture opposing knights for ransom, just as in real battle. Weapons were sometimes blunted, but not always, and armor did not always provide complete protection. Bloodshed was expected, and fatalities were not unusual. One infamous example of the violent nature of these events occurred in 1274 at a tournament involving King Edward I of England and the Count of Chalon. Although it began as a noble competition, the match quickly spiraled out of control. What started as a personal combat between the king and the count escalated into a deadly skirmish involving dozens of knights and their retinues. The violence intensified, swords were drawn in earnest, and the field turned into a real battlefield. Multiple participants lost their lives in the conflict, underscoring just how easily these events could transition from sport to deadly engagement. Despite the risk, the popularity of tournaments only grew. They were used to settle disputes, show off a knight's military readiness, and reinforce alliances between noble houses. Monarchs both encouraged and regulated tournaments, recognizing their usefulness for training and recruitment, but also fearing the disorder they sometimes caused. Over time, in the late medieval period, more structured rules and safety measures were introduced. The joust, the head-to-head combat with lances, became the centerpiece of most tournaments, and though still dangerous, it was easier to control and judge. Armor was refined for better protection, and codes of conduct were more strictly enforced. Yet even then, fatalities continued to occur. Tournaments were never merely performances. They were high-stakes demonstrations of martial prowess, and the risk of death remained an ever-present part of the spectacle. For medieval knights, entering the list was both an honor and a genuine test of survival. Number 5. Chivalry and the Church. The image of the medieval knight is often one of a heavily armed warrior, loyal to king and country. But what is less commonly understood is just how deeply intertwined knighthood was with the Christian Church. During the Middle Ages, being a knight was not only about martial prowess or serving a feudal lord, it was also about living by a moral code rooted in religious duty. This code, known as chivalry, evolved over time and became a guiding ideal for knights across Europe, strongly influenced by the doctrines and expectations of the Church. The origins of this relationship can be traced back to the end of the 11th century, particularly with Pope Urban II's famous call for the First Crusade in 1095. Urban urged Christian knights to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. This appeal was not framed as mere warfare, but as a sacred duty, a holy mission sanctioned by God. It was during this period that knights began to be seen not just as warriors, but as defenders of the faith. Their swords and armor became tools of divine justice, and participating in crusades was believed to absolve sins and earn eternal salvation. This religious framing elevated the role of the knight from that of a soldier to something more symbolic, a servant of both king and Christ. The church recognized the powerful role knights played and sought to influence their values and behavior through the concept of chivalry. Chivalry began as a martial and social code, emphasizing honor, bravery, and respect for women, but the church added layers of spiritual responsibility. Knights were expected to protect the weak, defend the poor, uphold justice, and remain loyal not just to their lords, but to the teachings of Christianity. Religious symbolism was embedded into many aspects of a knight's life, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the transformation of the knighting ceremony itself. What began as a relatively simple feudal ritual grew into a formal, church-influenced rite. By the 12th century, it became common for a squire about to be knighted to spend the night before the ceremony in prayer at a chapel, sometimes fasting or engaging in confession. The following morning, dressed in white to symbolize purity, he would take part in a solemn mass before kneeling to receive his sword, not only from a lord but often with a priest's blessing. This public declaration of loyalty was not just to a monarch, but also to God, making knighthood a spiritual as well as a secular commitment. Knights often bore crosses on their tunics or shields, not only as identifiers but as emblems of their religious devotion. Many took vows to defend the church, and some even joined religious military orders like the Knights Templar or Knights Hospitaller, blending monastic life with martial discipline. In this way, chivalry and the church became inseparable, forming a moral framework that shaped the ideals, actions, and legacy of medieval knighthood. Number 6, when knights fell out of fashion. For centuries, knights were the dominant force on European battlefields, symbolizing not only military superiority but also social prestige and moral authority. However, by the 16th century, the golden age of the knight had ended. The decline of knighthood was not sudden, but the result of gradual and irreversible changes in military technology, battlefield tactics, and social structure. One of the most critical factors in the decline of knights was the evolution of warfare itself. Medieval warfare was largely built around the use of heavy cavalry with knights at its core. Their specialized training, war horses, and armor made them nearly unstoppable in one-on-one combat and crucial in feudal conflicts. But this dominance began to crumble when mass infantry tactics gained prominence. Leaders like James IV of Scotland started to favor the use of disciplined, tightly packed infantry formations, especially pikemen. The Swiss and German Landsknechts perfected the use of long pikes in a dense phalanx formations that could neutralize cavalry charges. Against a wall of 20-foot-long pikes held by trained soldiers, even the most experienced knight in full-plate armor could do little. The sheer efficiency and cost-effectiveness of massed pikemen made them the preferred choice for many commanders. Unlike knights, who required years of expensive training and costly equipment, pikemen could be trained relatively quickly and equipped at a fraction of the cost. This made them ideal for the larger standing armies that were becoming necessary as wars expanded in scale and frequency. The shift in military structure also meant that loyalty was now being directed more towards centralized monarchies rather than local feudal lords, weakening the social role of knights. Another major blow to knightly warfare came with the rise of gunpowder weapons. The introduction of muskets and early firearms dramatically changed battlefield dynamics. A musket could be fired by a conscript with minimal training and was capable of piercing armor that had been painstakingly forged to stop swords, arrows, or lances. The heavily armored knight, once nearly invincible on the field, became a slow-moving target for ranged fire. The idea that a common soldier with a musket could kill a noble knight symbolized a dramatic shift in the social and military order of Europe. As firearms improved in accuracy and reliability, the necessity for hand-to-hand combat declined, and with it the need for elite warrior classes like knights. By the late 16th century, the elaborate rituals of knighthood and the romantic ideals of chivalry were increasingly viewed as outdated. Though the title of knight persisted in a ceremonial and honorary sense, its battlefield relevance had disappeared. The armored cavalryman was replaced by the professional soldier, and knighthood became more about status and tradition than military function. The fall of the knight was not due to any failure on their part, but rather a result of progress, technological, tactical, and political, that reshaped the face of war and rendered their unique skill set obsolete.